Module 3, the inspection process. Here is what we'll be covering in this module. We'll start with some stuff you need to do and you need to know before you even leave the office to do your first home inspection. That includes technical competency, standards of practice, tools and equipment, the pre-inspection agreement, and having a quality report format. Then we'll move on to the inspection process itself, which includes communication and consistency, and how to conduct yourself at the inspection. We'll begin with before you leave the office. Let's talk about what technical competency actually means. First of all, to do a home inspection properly, you don't need to be a custom home builder. You don't need to know everything there is about designing homes or building homes. However, you do need a general knowledge of the systems and components of a home. And you definitely need to know when something is damaged, when it's not working properly, or when it's been installed improperly. And you also need to be able to recognize potentially hazardous situations. This is really what we do. We are function and safety inspectors. Licensing curriculums such as this one teach technical competency. That's what we have to do. And now you might not be in a state where you have to have home inspection licensing, but nevertheless, this is considered a licensing curriculum or a pre-license curriculum. It means the same thing. The states that require licensing require all training companies to teach technical competency. And truthfully, in a program that's 40 hours or 60 hours or 80 hours, the best you can hope is to teach technical competency. As you're probably aware, we get better at everything in life simply with experience. So we give you the technical competency that you need. You go out, you get experience. That's how you get better. In simple terms, technical competency is simply using both technical knowledge and common sense to locate issues that would be dangerous or would cost a lot of money to correct. And we're serious about using common sense. If it seems wrong to you as a home inspector, it probably is. It's the job of the professional tradesperson to understand all the details of the specialized systems and components in their particular trade. As an example, if you think a furnace isn't operating correctly, you should report it and recommend further evaluation by a qualified heating contractor. It's up to that tradesperson to understand exactly what goes on with the furnace particularly and how to correct the situation. But you just simply have to be technically competent enough to realize that the furnace is not operating as it was designed. We talked about this earlier, so let's review. Remember what the home inspector's role is. You're only there to produce a written report of the general condition of the house and garage. And of course, as we understand when we say general condition, it does mean that you list individual defects. But those individual defects, when listed together in a report, give your client an idea of the general condition of the home. And we do this at the time of the inspection based on a limited visual examination and using normal operating controls. That's what we do. So knowing when to recommend further evaluation by the proper qualified tradesperson is much more important than knowing everything there is to know about residential construction or residential design. And we are not code experts. Home inspectors offer expert opinions that are not legally binding. We can't cause anybody to do anything. It's completely up to your client to take further action on what you've recommended in the report. And they don't have to do anything. You provide a report, they pay you, your job is done. Earlier, we talked about these two major professional associations. ASHI and INTERNACHI are the two largest voluntary professional associations for home inspectors in North America. And I want to take a second to clarify something here. We did talk earlier about using a set of standards from one of these two associations. And in fact, this is the exact same slide that we showed you in that last module. I just want to make sure that you understand that you don't actually have to join either one of these associations in order to be able to use their standards of practice. What is actually illegal is to say that you're a member of ASHI or a member of INTERNACHI when in fact you're not. But to simply say that you're using their standards of practice, well, that's okay. It's completely legal. And in fact, it's done all the time. And neither one of these associations is going to mind if you use their standards, as long as you don't claim that you're a member of their group if you're not. And that would also mean then that if you're not a member, you cannot use either association's logo on any of your printed material, like your brochure or your report. And you can't use it on your website, unless you join one of these groups. But you can still use their standards of practice without joining. Now, whether or not you should join one of these organizations, that's entirely up to you. But I think it might be a good idea. The standards of practice for either of these associations can be viewed online on their websites. And you can see their website addresses right here on the screen. Now, as we talked about earlier, these two sets of standards are about 80 to 85% of the same basic material as to what they cover. But there are some differences from each other. So if you're not in a licensed state, you have your choice of which standard to use. I would recommend completing this course, going through all 24 educational modules. And at that point, you'll have a better feel for what home inspection is all about. And that would be a great time for you to examine both standards and see which one you like best. Now, if you are in a licensed state, then your state law may dictate for you what standard you're going to have to go by. Or a lot of times, you simply just have to use the state standard. A lot of times in licensed states, the state standard was actually derived from ASHI because they are the oldest association. So this course has been written in accordance with the American Society of Home Inspectors Standard of Practice March 1, 2014 edition. And yes, ASHI calls theirs a standard, singular, not standards, plural. And as I've said, INTERNACHI also has standards. But ASHI is the oldest and most universally recognized set of standards in courts of law and in licensed states. And as we've said, ASHI and INTERNACHI standards are similar, but there are differences. And again, for the rest of this course, even if you've looked at the ASHI and the INTERNACHI standards for now, and you decided that you really like the INTERNACHI standard better, well, that's fine. But for the rest of this course, all 24 educational modules are written in full accordance with the ASHI Standard of Practice, effective March 1, 2014. The ASHI Standard of Practice, Section 2.1, Purpose and Scope, says this. The purpose of this document is to establish a minimum standard for home inspections performed by home inspectors who subscribe to this standard. Home inspections performed using this standard are intended to provide the client with information about the condition of inspected systems and components at the time of the home inspection. The highlighted areas in green will be defined in the following slides. From the ASHI Standard of Practice Glossary, home inspection is defined as the process by which an inspector visually examines the readily accessible systems and components of a home and describes those systems and components using the standard. System is defined as being a combination of interacting or interdependent components assembled to carry out one or more functions. And a component is simply part of a system. Part of a system. Section 2.2a says, the inspector shall observe readily accessible, visually observable installed systems and components listed in the standard. From the glossary, readily accessible is defined as being available for visual inspection without requiring moving of personal property, dismantling, destructive measures or actions that will likely involve risk to persons or property. This is a very important definition for a home inspector. This is why, as we've been discussing in the previous modules, this is why we don't move furniture around. This is why we don't cut walls open or pull carpet up to take a look at the subflooring. This is why you don't necessarily have to walk on a roof either, because that might involve risk to you if you're nervous about that. This is the essence of a home inspection process right here. Things that are available for visual inspection. So really, we don't do all that much more than what a homeowner would do in their daily course of events. Heating equipment is operated from the thermostat only, not from circuit breakers or shutoff switches. And plumbing fixtures are checked with normal faucets, not with shutoff valves underneath the sink. This is a very, very important definition for us. Installed means that the item is attached, such that removal requires tools. So that's another important definition. We inspect installed systems. So this would not be an installed heater. If this is the only source of heat in the room, you should put that on the report that they didn't have a permanent source of heat. Because this is not installed. It doesn't require the use of tools to remove it. You simply unplug it from the wall. Because it's not installed, their current owner can take it with them when they move out. Standard Section 2.2b1 states that the inspector shall provide the client with a written report using a format and medium selected by the inspector. When they use the word medium, they simply mean that you can produce a report in any method you would like, whether you print it on paper or you send it digitally to the client over the internet by email or upload it to an FTP site. That's all that means. So you have to provide the client with a written report that states those systems and components inspected that in the professional judgment of the inspector are not functioning properly, significantly deficient, unsafe, or are near the end of their service lives. So when they say the professional judgment of the inspector, that means it's your opinion, literally. And these are the items we're supposed to be reporting on. Things that don't work, things that are not safe, things that are getting old and are likely to break very soon. The ASHI glossary defines unsafe as being a condition in a readily accessible installed system or component that is judged by the inspector to be a significant risk of serious bodily injury during normal day-to-day use. The risk may be due to damage, deterioration, improper installation, or a change in accepted residential construction practices. Now, that last phrase, a change in accepted residential construction practices, you probably realize that they're talking about building codes. So, it's a somewhat veiled way of saying that if you would like to report that didn't used to be an issue, but it is now because of building codes, you can. So, instead of being cryptic about it, let me give you a specific example. Knob and tube wiring. Now, perhaps you're not familiar with what knob and tube is, and we'll be talking about it in the electrical modules toward the end of this course. But knob and tube wiring is the original wiring system in a home. And believe it or not, by code, if you have a completely virgin, completely untouched knob and tube system in an older home, it's actually grandfathered in. It is not required by code to be changed out. However, modern codes require grounding of electrical systems for safety. And this is an area where, perhaps, you might want to recommend they consider having the wiring upgraded. And you wouldn't say to meet current code, but you would say to meet current standards of safety. So that's a veiled way of saying you would recommend they upgrade it to meet code. But we're really not there to report code. We're there to report safety. Because we've talked about several times, building codes and safety go hand in hand. And building codes are written to protect safety or to help create safer situations. So that's what they mean by this last phrase, a change in accepted residential construction practices. If you want to mention something in terms of safety, you can and should. Standard Section 2.2b2 says that we have to report recommendations to correct or to monitor for future correction the deficiencies reported in 2.2b1 or items needing further evaluation. As per exclusion 13.2a5, the inspector is not required to determine methods, materials, or costs of corrections. Now, we'll be looking up the exclusions in a few slides. The ASHI glossary tells us further evaluation is examination and analysis by qualified professional tradesmen or a service technician beyond that provided by a home inspection. This is exactly what we've been talking about. You don't have to know everything about how the house goes together. But you do need to understand when something is not operating correctly or appears to have been installed improperly. So you refer that off by recommending further evaluation. And then it's the role of the tradesperson, if your client even chooses to have this evaluated, that's up to them. But if they choose to go along with your recommendation to have something evaluated, it's the role of that tradesperson to come in, determine exactly what's wrong, determine how to correct it, and provide a cost estimate to your client. Section 2.2b3 and 2.2b4 says that we have to report reasoning or explanation as to the nature of the deficiencies reported in 2.2b1 that are not self-evident. So, an example of something that's self-evident, broken glass. So, if you have broken glass in a window, everybody understands that's a safety issue. That's possibly a weather issue. You're going to be losing heat through the hole in the window. Everybody gets why you have to repair broken glass. Something that's not as obvious to people, To go back to the example I used a couple of slides ago with the knob and tube wiring, that's the original wiring system. It's not grounded. And again, if you don't understand what grounding means, we'll teach you that towards the end of this course in the electrical modules. But that system is not grounded. So, if you simply put in your report that you recommend further evaluation of the wiring system because it does not appear to be grounded, your client probably doesn't understand what that means. So, that would not be self-evident. So, this standard section is saying that you need to explain to your client what it means to not be grounded. And 2.2b4 says that we report those systems and components designated for inspection in the standard that were present at the time of the home inspection, but were not inspected, along with the reason why. So, for example, something you would normally inspect is completely inaccessible. Let's say the home is on a crawl space, and you're quite sure there's a sump pump. You saw the discharge at the exterior of the house. Maybe you've even heard it operating while you're inspecting the home. But for some reason, there is completely no access to the crawl space. So on your report, you would say, sump pump appears to be in the crawl space, which was inaccessible at the time of the inspection. Maybe you would give a reason why it was inaccessible. The crawl space hatch was nailed shut. Or, it was covered with wall-to-wall carpeting. Yeah, I've actually seen that, believe it or not. So again, what they're trying to do with Section 4 is give you, the professional home inspector, the opportunity to use your professional judgment and report that, I'd like to inspect this, but I couldn't, and here's why. Section 2.2c states, the inspector shall adhere to the ASHI Code of Ethics for the home inspection profession. Now, that's available in the ICA reference library, and you can also get that at ASHI.org. Section 2.3 states that this standard is not intended to limit the inspector from including other services or systems and components in addition to those required in Section 2.2a. So, they're saying that you don't have to stick to the standard. If you'd want to inspect other areas not listed in the standard, you can, although there might be a legal application to that. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. And B says that the standard is not intended to limit the inspector from designing or specifying repairs provided the inspector is appropriately qualified and willing to do so. Now, generally, home inspectors stay away from design and specifying repairs. But what they're trying to say here is, let's say you're a heating contractor by trade, and you also do home inspections. And in less densely populated areas, it's pretty common where a tradesperson is also a home inspector. When you have a county where there's only 10,000 people in the entire county or only 5,000 people in the entire county, which is common in a lot of rural areas, it's going to be hard to support yourself as just a home inspector or even as just a heating contractor. So a lot of individuals choose to do both. So what the standard is saying here is if you're a qualified heating contractor and you inspect a home and you see that the furnace isn't operating properly, if you want to talk to the client about how to correct the situation, as far as the standard is concerned, you can. Now, I will tell you that there are some legal implications with this as well. Most attorneys will tell you that if you are both a tradesperson and a home inspector, that what you ought to be doing legally is do the home inspection, keep that separate from any other trade that you offer. So you do your home inspection using your home inspection contract, you provide the report. And, by the way, you probably ought to advise a client at the beginning of the home inspection that you are also a heating contractor, just to disclose any potential conflict of interest. So you've done your home inspection, you've given the report. And then at that point, legally, if you want to become the heating contractor, you do that separately. And that's what almost any attorney would tell you to do. 2.3c says that the standard is not intended to limit you from excluding systems and components from inspection if requested or agreed to by the client. Let's say that at the beginning of the inspection, the client says, "You know what? You don't even have to inspect the garage. I know it's getting ready to fall over. So as soon as we close this deal, we're going to have it knocked down and we're going to have a new garage built." Fine. So you can exclude that. You would put that on your report that the garage was not included in the inspection as per the client. And you would make sure that that's on your contract as well. If you've looked at the ASHI Standards of Practice, then you've already seen that it starts off with introductory material, which we just covered. And then you'll have a series of technical sections, which I'm going to skip over right now. And then at the end of the standard are all the general limitations and exclusions. We're going to cover all of the technical sections as we go through each educational module. So the next module after this will be roofing. And at the beginning of that module, we will cover the roofing standard. So we're going to skip over that stuff for now, cover it later. And we'll move on to the ASHI Standard Section 13.1, General Limitations. A. The inspector is not required to perform actions or to make determinations or to make recommendations not specifically stated in the standard. So this is telling you simply that if it's not in the standard, you don't have to do it. And if someone gets upset about that and they wanted to take you to court, and again, no one ever really takes you to court over something like this, but the point is, they can't make you do it. If you're sticking to the standard of practice, and it's clearly indicated in your inspection agreement that you're using the ASHI standard of practice, you only have to do things that are listed in the standard. It's very clear. Section B. Inspections performed using the standard are not technically exhaustive, are not required to identify and to report concealed conditions, latent defects, consequential damages. Now, let me stop right there. What they're talking about is things hidden that we're not going to see, hidden within wall cavities that we're not going to open, or some type of stains or damage underneath wall-to-wall carpeting that we're not going to pull up. That's what they're talking about with concealed conditions and latent defects. B. We don't have to identify and report cosmetic imperfections that do not significantly affect a component's performance of its intended function. In other words, we're not there to talk about things that are dirty and ugly. We're there to report on function and safety only. Now, the ASHI glossary defines technically exhaustive as being an investigation that involves dismantling, the extensive use of advanced techniques, measurements, instruments, testing, calculations, or other means. So the standard just said that we're not going to do an inspection that's technically exhaustive. We're simply walking through the property using normal operating controls. We're not going to bring in all sorts of instrumentation and equipment and spend 8 or 10 or 12 hours in the home and measure everything. We're not going to do that stuff. We don't have to, because the standard excludes that for us. Standard Section 13.1c states that this standard applies to buildings with 4 or fewer dwelling units and their attached and detached garages and carports. I've talked about this a couple of times already so far in this course. This is a very important concept. If you have a client that is buying a 6-flat apartment building and they're buying the entire building, not just a condominium apartment in that building, So you have someone buying the entire 6 flat as an investment. That is not a home inspection. Believe it or not, that is a commercial inspection. Even in states with licensing laws, almost every state with a home inspection licensing law follows the same idea that the license applies to buildings with 4 or fewer dwelling units. So, in most states where home inspectors are licensed, a 6-flat apartment building is still considered commercial. And you don't need a license to do that. Then, of course, in states where home inspectors are not licensed, well, commercial inspections aren't going to be licensed either. So, if you have a client buying a single condominium apartment in a larger building, or they're buying a townhouse unit in a larger development, either one of those are going to be home inspections for sure. And if you're in a state that licenses home inspectors, you would have to be licensed to do that condominium or to inspect that townhouse. But strip malls and 6-flat or 10-flat apartment buildings, those are commercial because they do not have 4 or fewer dwelling units. (13D) states that the standard shall not limit or prevent the inspector from meeting state statutes which license professional home inspection and home inspectors. So they're simply saying that state law is going to supersede the standard of practice. 13.1e states that redundancy in the description of the requirements, limitations, and exclusions regarding the scope of the home inspection is provided for emphasis only. So they're simply acknowledging the fact that they might have mentioned some of the stuff 2 or 3 times simply to drive the point home. This is a 4-unit apartment building. So the standard of practice definitely applies to this building. In fact, it would apply in either situation, whether your client was buying the entire building as an investment or if your client was simply buying one of the apartments as a condominium or a townhouse arrangement. Either way, the standard will apply to this building. This is a 5-unit apartment building plus some office space right down at the street level. So the standard of practice does not apply to this building because it's 5 dwelling units plus the office space. That is considered to be commercial. And again, not only does the ASHI standard not apply to this building, but neither would almost any state licensing law. And by the way, both the NAHI standard and the INTRNACHI standard also say the same thing, that their standard applies to buildings with 4 or fewer dwelling units. So everybody is pretty much in agreement on the definition of a home inspection. It's 4 or fewer dwelling units. Standard Section 13.2A1, the inspector is not required to determine the condition of systems and components that are not readily accessible. We just looked at the definition of readily accessible a few slides ago. And it's in plain English. You know what they mean. So here they're excluding anything that's not readily accessible. So a couple of examples. You're supposed to inspect the attic and everything in the attic. But the attic hatch has been nailed shut. And to make it even better, they caulked it and painted it too. Well, the attic is no longer readily accessible. You don't have to inspect it. Of course, you're going to have to put it on the report as being not accessible and not inspected. Another example of something that's not readily accessible. If there is a hole in the dining room wall, well, if that hole has been covered by a china hutch, you don't have to move the china hutch. So that defect is not readily accessible. You're not responsible for it. A2, We're not required to determine the remaining life expectancy of systems and components. In fact, that can only get you in trouble. You may or may not know that the national average life expectancy of a forced air furnace is about 20 years. So if you're inspecting the home, the current furnace is about 15 years old, and your client asks you, "How much longer do you think this furnace is going to last?" Well, if you know that the national average life expectancy is 20 years, you might be tempted to say it probably should last another 5 years. But the way that can get you in trouble is because if the client goes ahead and purchases that home, and then a year from now that furnace starts to have all sorts of trouble, and it gets to the point where heating contractor simply says, you might be better off replacing this furnace at this point because the repairs will cost so much money. Well, you know what? The client may come back to you and say, you owe us money for the furnace because we largely based our decision to purchase the home on the fact that you told us that the furnace might last another 5 years and it hasn't. So, you really need to stay away from telling your client how long anything might last. And, as you know from common sense, that type of stuff is very unpredictable. A3. We're not required to determine the strength, adequacy, effectiveness, and efficiency of any systems or components. Though, if the client says, "Can we add a second floor to this home? Is the foundation strong enough?" Well, it probably is, but we don't have to answer that question. Simply tell your client that they need to talk to a general contractor or an architect. Or if they want to know, is the furnace actually large enough for the house in capacity, we don't have to determine that. Later on in this course, we will talk about obvious mismatches with furnaces being too small as an example. But generally speaking, that's not why we're there. We are looking for function and safety, so these types of things are excluded. A4. We're not required to determine the causes of conditions and deficiencies. And if you're coming into this industry as a tradesperson, you're really going to enjoy this. Because if you find a stain on a ceiling, it's probably from a roof leak. But you don't have to figure out exactly where it's leaking from. That's going to be the responsibility of the roofer or some other tradesperson that was brought in later to find out what caused the stain. As a home inspector, you don't have to worry about it. Now, if something is obvious, you would report it that way. If there's a hole in the roof or a flashing is obviously open and it's all wet in the attic, certainly you would report that. But generally speaking, we don't have to talk about the causes of conditions or the deficiencies. We simply report on the symptoms and recommend further evaluation by a qualified tradesperson. And in that same idea, A5, we don't have to report on methods, materials, or cost of corrections. So we don't have to figure out why something is wrong. We don't have to figure out what's causing it. We don't have to talk about how much it might cost to correct it. We simply recommend further evaluation by the proper qualified tradesperson. And it's up to them to talk to the client about what it's going to cost to fix and how they fix it and so forth. And remember, the client is under no obligation to even have a tradesperson come in. All we have to do is report the defect and we're done. It's up to the client to get anything looked at. A6. We're not required to determine future conditions, including but not limited to failure of systems and components. And that really goes right along with A2, remaining life expectancy. We can't predict the future. We don't want to predict the future. That can only get us into trouble. A7. The inspector is not required to determine the suitability of the property for specialized uses. So, as a home inspector, no, you have no idea if they can open a beauty salon on their property. They can check with the real estate agent. Even better, they should go down to the town hall or whatever local government body there is and check with them. Check with the zoning department. They are the ones that can answer that question. We don't answer that question. We're only concerned about function and safety. A8. We're not required to determine the compliance of systems and components with past and present requirements and guidelines. Specifically, codes, regulations, laws, ordinances, specifications, installation and maintenance instructions, use and care guides, and so forth. So this section excludes building codes for us. And it also excludes the inspector having to determine if something has been installed exactly as per the manufacturer's recommendations. Now again, you're going to use common sense. If you think something has not been installed properly, you're definitely going to put that on the report. A9. Not required to determine the market value of the property and its marketability. That has everything to do with the appraiser. We have nothing to do with market value. We don't know what the property is worth. Can the property be sold later? That's not our area. We're simply there for function and safety. A10. The advisability of purchasing the property. Absolutely, we never want to tell the client whether or not they should purchase the property. Even if they think the property is in great shape, that's up to them to decide to buy it, not us. So you will get questions from your client. They'll say, "Hey, I know you see a lot of houses. Based on the condition of this home, what do you think? Should we buy it or not? Or are we paying too much for the property? What do you think?" Well, again, we have no knowledge of pricing, at least officially. I mean, absolutely, as an inspector, you're going to get a pretty good feel for prices in your area. But officially, we know nothing about pricing or value and, definitely, whether or not your client buys the home. Has to be their decision and no one else's. A11. As an inspector, you are not required to determine the presence of plants, animals, or other life forms and substances that may be hazardous or are harmful to humans, including to, but not limited to, wood-destroying organisms, molds, and mold-like substances. Well, wood-destroying organisms is termites and carpenter ants and powder-posed beetles. And we did talk earlier about many inspectors including that as an added service. Of course, that's something that's licensed separately with separate training. And the same thing with mold. While mold inspections or mold testing are not typically licensed anywhere, there are certainly some separate training you would want to get for that. If you want to offer any of these as an additional service, that's great, but you should do that under a separate contract from your home inspection contract. And the home inspection standard of practice specifically excludes that. So, as an inspector, you don't have to offer pest inspections or mold inspections. You can simply stick to the core function of being a function and safety inspector. A12. You're not required to determine the presence of environmental hazards including, but not limited to, allergens, toxins, carcinogens, electromagnetic radiation, noise, radioactive substances, and contaminants in building materials, soil, water, and air. Now, absolutely, many inspectors will alert their clients, even in the report, if they feel there might be something present, such as asbestos, and recommend further evaluation by a qualified testing agency or testing company. But you don't have to do that. So, if you think there is asbestos, as far as the standard of practice goes, you don't have to say anything. Again, if you want to as a customer service, you can, and many inspectors do. Now, the other thing in A12 is it specifically says noise, So, if your client is buying a home near an airport, as an example, or near a railroad freight yard, or they're buying a condominium that's right over a nightclub, we're not responsible for those types of things. So, if they determine after they move in that it's very noisy, well, that's buyer beware. That's not up to us. We are there for function and safety only. A13. As the inspector, you're not required to determine the effectiveness of systems installed and methods used to control or remove suspected hazardous plants, animals, and environmental hazards. A good example would be a radon mitigation system. That is excluded for us on the standard of practice. We don't have to talk about whether it works or not. We don't have to inspect it. So if the client says, "Is that effectively removing the radon from this home?" we don't have to tell them that. It is not included. A14. We don't determine operating costs of systems and components. If your client would like to know what the monthly or annual fuel bill is for the gas furnace, we don't know. They can check with the current owner. Or they can ask their real estate agent to try to get that information. Or they can call the utility directly. But we don't have to answer that question. A15. We don't determine acoustical properties of systems and components. So, if your client is, again, buying a condominium or a home near an airport, we can't tell them if they're going to be annoyed by that exterior noise or not. Or if they're buying a condominium, we can't tell them that the common wall between the unit next door and their unit is going to be thick enough or insulated well enough so that they may not hear their neighbors at certain times. A16. We don't determine soil conditions related to geotechnical or hydrologic specialties. We don't really know what's going on in the ground. A17. The inspector is not required to determine whether items, materials, conditions, and components are subject to recall, controversy, litigation, product liability, or any other adverse claims or conditions. There are some inspectors that will alert their clients on the report if they discover anything in the home that might be subject to a recall. And in fact, there's actually a service that home inspectors can subscribe to that will alert the inspector a couple of times a week whenever there are some new recalls that hit the market. Now, actually, this company is getting their information from the Consumer Product Safety Commission website. And you can bypass this service and go directly to the CPSC website and learn about these recalls if you are so inclined. So yeah, telling your client about recalls or possible controversial products, yeah, that's possibly good customer service. However, there is a big legal implication with this. And I'll give you a good example. Let's say you inspect a home and you discover a furnace that's subject to a current recall as published on the Consumer Product Safety Commission website. There's some type of a potential safety issue with the furnace. So you go ahead and you put that on the report and you let your client know. So the client buys the house and they move in and they have the furnace dealt with accordingly. However, unbeknownst to you and your client, there was also a recall on the dishwasher. And as it turns out, not long after your client moves in, the dishwasher starts on fire and causes $50,000 worth of damage to the home. If the client should discover later that the dishwasher was also subject to recall, the fact that you didn't mention it on the report, but you did mention the recall on the furnace, may make you liable for that. So that's why legally it's probably best to stick with the standard of practice and simply stay away from recalls or any type of controversy. Just stick with what we're there to focus on: function and safety. 13.2b. The inspector is not required to offer or to perform acts or services contrary to law or to government regulations. And B2, we don't have to offer or perform architectural, engineering, contracting, or surveying services, or to confirm or evaluate such services performed by others. We have nothing to do with that type of stuff. A look at the ASHI glossary tells us that engineering is defined as the application of scientific knowledge for the design, control, or use of building structures, equipment, or apparatus. So we are definitely not doing any type of engineering. And we don't want to confirm engineering done by anyone else. Section 13.2b3. We're not required to offer or to perform trades or professional services other than home inspection. And this is an important point right here, B4. We don't offer warranties or guarantees of any kind. The home inspection is not a warranty. And it's important to make sure the client understands that when you take that initial call from the client. When they ask you for your price, and then they say, yeah, I want to go ahead and give you the job, here's the address, at that point, you need to go over a few things with the client, including this: that the inspection is not a warranty or a guarantee of any kind. And you need to talk to them about the fact that things can break at any time, or that the neighbors can't control baseball through a window at some point after the inspection. So, just as we talked about earlier in this course, the home inspection is really only valid legally for that 2 or 3 hour period while you were in the home. Well, you need to make sure your client understands that. So let them know the inspection is not a warranty. If they are concerned about that, or they really want to purchase a home warranty, they can talk to the real estate agent about buying some type of warranty coverage. And those types of policies are sold by real estate agencies, but we are definitely not going to offer that to the client. (13.2c). We are not going to operate systems or components that are shut down or otherwise inoperable. And we'll define what shutdown means in just a minute. We don't operate systems and components that do not respond to normal operating control. So literally, if you can't get the furnace started from the thermostat, you're done. And you'll report it that way. But you're under no obligation to go around the home and try to figure out if the furnace is shut off somewhere else or at a circuit breaker. All we do is use normal operating controls. C3. We don't operate shutoff valves and manual stop valves. Those are the valves underneath the sink or underneath the toilet. We only check the toilet by flushing it with a flush handle. And we open faucets. But if shutoff valves are in the closed position, we don't open those. We simply report it that way. And we don't operate automatic safety controls. For example, we would not operate the temperature and pressure relief valve on a water heater. In the ASHI glossary, shutdown is defined as a state in which a system or component cannot be operated by normal operating controls. That said, it's very simple. Normal operating controls are defined as being devices such as thermostats, switches, and valves intended to be operated by the homeowner. So while a shutoff valve underneath a sink could certainly be operated by the homeowner, that's not what they're going to use in the day-to-day operation of their home. If you go into the bathroom and you want to wash your hands, you expect water to come out of the faucet simply by opening the faucet, not the shutoff valve. So that's not considered a normal operating control. And circuit breakers are not normal operating controls. The homeowner does not turn on lights and turn off lights from circuit breakers. They do so from wall switches. So if you're inspecting this home and you find these circuits shut off, just the way you see in the photo, you would report it that way. You would not turn these on. If the current owner is home at the time, it's certainly okay to ask the current owner why these circuits are shut off. But you're not going to turn them on your own and see what happens. That could potentially be dangerous. 13.2d. The inspector is not required to enter any areas in the professional judgment of the inspector that will likely be dangerous to the inspector or to other persons, or to damage a property or systems and components. So again, this is in your professional judgment. If you open a crawlspace hatch and it's full of water, in your judgment that may be dangerous to you, you don't have to go in that crawlspace. You don't have to damage the property. So again, we've talked earlier about an attic hatch that's been screwed shut and caulked shut. Well, you could make the argument that trying to open that hatch would damage the property. So they're going to have to cut through caulking, you'll damage the paint, so you don't have to enter that attic space. You would simply report it as being inaccessible at the time of inspection. D2. You're not required to enter underfloor crawlspace areas in attics that are not readily accessible. And we saw the definition of readily accessible earlier on in this module. (13.2e). The inspector is not required to inspect underground items including, but not limited to, underground storage tanks and other underground indications of their presence, whether abandoned or active. So if there is an old fuel oil tank or even an active fuel oil tank, you're not responsible for it. So if the home currently has fuel oil, well, you don't know if that tank is leaking or not. And if the home formerly had fuel oil that's been converted to propane or natural gas, well, you don't know if there's an old storage tank in the ground or not. If there is, you're not responsible for it. Now, having said that, many inspectors, if they suspect there is an underground tank, will go ahead and alert their client in the report to the possible presence of that tank and recommend further evaluation or testing. But you don't have to say anything about it. E2. We don't have to inspect items that are not installed. We saw the definition of installed earlier. It means something that's attached and would require the use of tools to remove it. So a light that hangs from the ceiling on a hook and the cord comes down, it's merely plugged into an outlet, that is not an installed lighting fixture. E3. We don't have to inspect installed decorative items. And the definition of decorative is ornamental, not required for the proper operation of the essential systems and components of a home. So it really has nothing to do with the function and safety of the home. This retractable awning is considered to be decorative. Why? Because it's not required for the proper operation of the essential systems of the home. You don't have to have a retractable awning for the home to operate properly and safely. Sure, it keeps out sunlight, but there's other ways to do that. As long as the windows function properly and as long as the siding is good, that's all you're concerned about here. Now, if the awning is damaged and it's falling off the house or it doesn't operate, could you report that? You could as a customer service, but it's definitely not included as part of the formal home inspection. (13.2e4). We don't inspect items in areas that are not entered in accordance with Section 13.2d, which we just looked at a few minutes ago. E5. We don't inspect detached structures other than garages and carports. Now, if there are other buildings, could you inspect those? Sure, but you should get a separate fee for that. And add that to your contract, that for the separate fee, you're going to do the barn or the shed or whatever they have. But those extra buildings are not included in the standard of practice. And unless you choose to do those, you're not responsible for them. E6. We don't inspect common elements and common areas in multiple unit houses such as condominium properties and cooperative housing. So if your client is buying a condominium apartment, so your client's not buying the whole building, they're simply buying this condominium unit, yes, that's definitely a home inspection, but your inspection starts at the front door of the condominium apartment itself, not the building. So if you enter the building through a door and an entryway and you go up some stairs or an elevator and then walk down a hallway, your inspection doesn't start right there. Your inspection starts when the door to that condominium unit is opened. So we don't do anything on the exterior. We don't do the roof. We don't do any of that type of stuff. It's all excluded in the standard of practice. E7. We're not required to inspect every occurrence of multiple similar components. So that does literally mean that you don't have to check every outlet in the house. However, I'd be careful with that. If you're going through a vacant home, your client is going to expect you to check every outlet you can get at. And in a vacant house, they're all accessible, so you should check them all. The reason this is written in the standard is to give you some professional discretion, especially if things are covered by furniture or blocked by stored items. As an example, you go into a bedroom. There's 2 windows. One window is going to be pretty difficult to get at because of furniture or stored personal items stacked up in front of the window. So this gives you the discretion to simply check the other window. That's all they're saying here. But again, don't take it as a blanket that you can go into a vacant home and just check 1 window per room or 1 outlet per room. That doesn't do your client any justice. And they're not going to like that. You just skipped over a lot of stuff. We're not required to inspect outdoor cooking appliances, so we don't have to do anything with exterior gas grills. (13.2F). The inspector is not required to perform procedures or operations that will, in the professional judgment of the inspector, likely to be dangerous to the inspector or to other persons, or to damage a property or systems or components. Now, we've read similar language like this earlier. Again, there is some redundancy in the standard, and that's okay. F2. We don't have to describe or report on systems or components that are not included in the standard and that were not inspected. And F3, we're not required to move personal property, furniture, equipment, plants, soil, snow, ice, and debris. It's a limited visual inspection. F4. We're not required to dismantle systems and components, except as explicitly required by the standard. And our definition of dismantle is to take apart or remove components, devices, or pieces of equipment that would not be taken apart or removed by the homeowner in the course of normal and routine homeowner maintenance. So you don't have to remove panels on a furnace that would not normally be removed by the homeowner. It's very simple. F5. The inspector is not required to reset, reprogram, or otherwise adjust devices, systems, or components affected by inspection required by the standard. A great example would be a programmable thermostat. So sure, you're going to try to get the furnace operating or the air conditioner operating from the thermostat. But let's face it, some of these devices are pretty complicated. Some of them are pretty goofy. And if you just can't figure out how to get that furnace started from that thermostat, well, the standard excludes that for us right here. You're not required to goof around with that thermostat and start trying to reset it or reprogram it. Of course, if you don't want to mess around with that thermostat, you definitely need to put that on the report. Make sure that the client understands that you were not able to get the furnace operating and that you did not reprogram the thermostat. They need to know that you weren't able to complete that part of the inspection. F6. We're not required to ignite or extinguish fires, pilot lights, burners, and other open flames that require manual ignition. So igniting or extinguishing a fire in a gas log fireplace, that's a great example of that. Or an older furnace that has a standing pilot light. We don't have to try to light that pilot light if it's out. In fact, if the pilot light was out, that would be a defect with the furnace that you would put on the report. F7. We're not required to probe surfaces that would be damaged or where no deterioration is visible or presumed to exist. So you're not required to start probing wood if you think it might be rotted, especially if there is no visible indication of the rotted wood. Basically, we don't want to be damaging cosmetic surfaces. At this point, we've been through the introductory sections of the standard of practice. We know what the definition of a home inspection is. We've seen a lot of the exclusions. Now, we haven't seen all of the exclusions yet because we haven't been through the technical sections. But even so, I've certainly alluded several times to exceeding the standards of practice. Now, as far as the standard itself, can you exceed the standard? Yes, you can, because as you may recall, we looked at Section 2.3a earlier in this module. And it does say that this standard is not intended to limit the inspector from including other systems or services and components in addition to those required in Section 2.2a. And you might recall that 2.2a simply said the inspector shall inspect readily accessible, visually observable installed systems and components listed in the standard. So yes, according to the standard, you can exceed the standard of practice. But legally, should you exceed the standard? Now, I've talked about this a few times already. Most attorneys are going to tell you to stay very close to the standard of practice. Whenever you exceed the standard of one area, you may incur liability if you didn't exceed the standard at some other problem area where the client feels you should have reported a defect. Here's an example. If you decide to operate a furnace that had been shut down, how was it shut down? The main switch at the side of the furnace was turned off. So you went ahead and turned it on and you operated the furnace. Well, if you did that, you went beyond the standard because the standard is clear that we don't have to operate anything that's been shut down. So then the client might feel you should have also reported the underground fuel oil tank that's been leaking into the ground. And you didn't say anything about it. So that's the way in which you can incur additional liability by exceeding the standard. Now, absolutely, most good home inspectors do exceed the standard of practice. As a good example, many inspectors use a lot more tools and equipment than required to simply meet the base standard. We're going to talk about tools coming up here shortly. So, if you exceed the standard, you should do so for customer service and have a plan or reason for doing so. Don't just exceed the standard haphazardly. And you're going to have a better feel for when to exceed the standard and when not to by the end of this course. In this example, as you now know, asbestos is excluded from the standard of practice. But many inspectors would recommend testing of any suspicious material that they see. And on this inspection, this is exactly how it appeared. We didn't have to remove any diffuser or cover from this duct. It was wide open, just like this. And the client actually asked about it before we even said anything. They saw it just as we did. And the client asked, "Is that asbestos?" Now, I can tell you I knew darn good well it was. But what I told the client was that, yes, possibly it is asbestos, and I do recommend that you consider having that tested. And I put it in the report that way. That's just good customer service. But yet that's an area that is definitely excluded from the standards. So this is an example of having a legitimate reason for exceeding the standard of practice. I didn't do it just on a whim or haphazardly. I did it for customer service because the client asked about it. And another way to look at it is, if I was buying the home and I knew nothing about asbestos and I saw that, I would certainly want my inspector to tell me that might be asbestos, so I would have a chance to get it tested. So customer service is often a good reason for exceeding the standard of practice. Now, let's have a look at tools and equipment used by home inspectors. And you'll see that we do use a wide variety of tools, usually many more than actually implied by the standard. Inspection tools are available locally through catalogs and online. There are also a lot of different price points for many of these tools. And of course, those price points reflect various options or simply overall quality. What you decide to use is going to depend on your own individual style, and you will develop a style over time. It's one of the beauties of the home inspection profession. We're not overly regulated to the point that we can't do things our own way. Sure, you have to follow the standard of practice, then you have to meet the requirements of your state licensing law if you're in one of those states. But generally, after that, it's up to you. So if you move a little quicker through a home or you take more time, that's all up to you. And after you do 50 inspections, 60 inspections, you're going to start to feel yourself developing a style. And that's exactly what you want. I'm going to develop a list of tools and equipment commonly used by home inspectors. Let's put the first four up simultaneously because these first four are all that you need to meet the standard of practice. No matter what you've heard from other home inspectors or what you may have learned in researching this profession before you decided to take this course, this is it right here. You need a flashlight. You need a good flashlight. You need as much light as possible in attics and crawl spaces or when you're trying to look underneath the kitchen sink down in the base cabinet. There are all sorts of decent flashlights available for reasonable cost, so get a flashlight. Or get a couple flashlights that give you a lot of light. You'll need a screwdriver simply for taking the cover off the electric panel. As we'll see later in the electrical section of the standard of practice, we are required to check the interior components of panels and subpanels. The way to do that is to remove the front cover. That's why you need a screwdriver. I've recommended a powered screwdriver simply to make that process a little bit easier for you. You're going to need one or more ladders. There are all sorts of articulated ladders and folding ladders that home inspectors like to use. Some of these ladders may be able to fit in your car. They can certainly fit in a van, an SUV, or a pickup truck. In densely populated urban areas where houses are close together and tend to be taller, many home inspectors carry 32-foot extension ladders with a ladder rack on their truck. And a lot of suburban areas inspectors are using combinations of 17-foot or 13-foot or 22-foot folding ladders. So what you use is going to depend on your area and your inspection style. And don't forget, we have to get inside the attic or at least examine it from the hatch. And you're going to need a ladder to do that too. It's not uncommon for some inspectors to carry 3 or 4 ladders with them, including a couple of step ladders. You'll need a GFCI outlet tester because the standard of practice tells us that we have to check GFCI outlets. Now, moving on to the list, a digital camera. You really should be taking high-quality photos of defects and putting those in a report. If you want to be competitive with other home inspectors in your area, you need to include photos in the report. It's the 21st century, that's what we have to do. Next on the list is a moisture meter. Most home inspectors carry a moisture meter. You can spend anywhere from $50 to $500 for a moisture meter. The most common use for a moisture meter is when you see a stain. You can use the meter to determine if it's currently wet or not. If it's currently wet, that means there's an active leak, whether that's from the roof, plumbing, or even seepage in the basement or crawl space. A moisture meter cannot prove that something does not leak at some point because if a stain is dry now, it simply means that it's dry now. Doesn't mean it will always be dry. But you can certainly prove if it's an active leak or not. A probe thermometer. Home inspectors that use this type of thermometer generally use it to check temperature drop in air conditioning. We'll talk much more about that in the air conditioning modules. Infrared thermometers. Home inspectors love infrared thermometers. They take the temperature of all sorts of things that are way beyond the standard of practice. Do you need an infrared thermometer? No, you really don't. I'll tell you what, I don't even have an infrared thermometer. But home inspectors love to use them for various reasons. They're not cheap either. A gas detector. Almost every inspector checks for gas leaks with some type of an instrument that will measure that. The most common is probably the TIF 8800. That's spelled TIF. There are other companies as well that make gas leak detection equipment, but the TIF 8800 is probably the most common one in the home inspection industry. The standard of practice is clear that we're doing a limited visual inspection, so you don't have to actually check for gas leaks with any type of instrumentation. But again, most inspectors do. So if you want to be competitive with the other inspectors in your area, you probably should also do so. That brings us to a voltage sniffer. This is a handheld device that you wave near a wire, and it will tell you if it's carrying current or not. So it's a way to find out if wiring that looks abandoned is currently live. Good binoculars. Especially if you're not going to walk on a roof, binoculars can really help. A 2-prong outlet tester. For older homes where the outlets don't have a ground prong. A water pressure gauge. Some training programs really push to use the water pressure gauge. In this training program, we do not. It's pretty easy to tell visually if water pressure or water flow is not what it should be. And it's pretty easy to tell when water pressure is much too high because you open a faucet and the water comes out with such force that it's hitting the sink and bouncing up and getting your shirt soaking wet. But in some areas of the country, inspectors like to use water pressure gauges, especially in areas where there are pressure regulators on their front lawn of the house. Again, I don't think that they're necessary. If you're in an area and you find out that a lot of home inspectors are using water pressure gauges, then maybe you'll want to also. But they're not really necessary, not in my opinion. An inspection mirror simply for looking behind things or looking underneath things. Some inspectors use carbon monoxide detection equipment just in the air in the home to see if there is elevated levels that could be dangerous. Other inspectors use some type of measuring equipment to check in the combustion products of furnaces and boilers and so forth. I would say the majority of home inspectors do not use this type of equipment. A multimeter or ammeter, that's an electrical measurement device. Some home inspectors use these for measuring the resistance coils on electric water heaters and electric furnaces. The majority of home inspectors do not use this equipment. Here you can see a home inspector taking the temperature of an electric resistance wall heater with an infrared thermometer. And it's hitting 238 degrees. That is not required by the standard of practice. In fact, is this inspector providing any useful information to the client? That's debatable. We know that electric resistance wall heaters do get very hot. Is this inspector going to report the temperature? Probably not. So, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of inspectors love infrared thermometers. I personally don't have one. I'm not trying to imply that they're completely useless. There is a lot of good things you can do with them, but you really don't need one to meet the standard of practice. Let's continue with our list of tools used by home inspectors. Pliers. Some inspectors carry those just in case. There's probably not much reason you would need them. Same thing as having some small wrenches. And just so you know, I'm just giving you a list of things that I've developed over the years that I've heard inspectors use. So I'm not saying that most inspectors carry all these things or that even some inspectors carry all of these things. I'm just giving you a look at what various inspectors use. I doubt there's any inspector that would have everything on this entire list. So the next item would be a tape measure. Some inspectors carry those mostly for the use of their client because a client sometimes asks, "Hey, do you have a tape measure? I want to see if our refrigerator will fit here," or "We want to see if our sofa fits in this wall." So it's mostly for the client's use. If we're going to have a bunch of tools, you need some way to carry them. So you need some type of tool bag or pouch for those. If you're taking handwritten notes, you'll need a clipboard. You probably should have some type of clean sheet or drop cloth. We looked at that earlier in this course. That's great for putting underneath an attic hatch, as an example, so that when you open the hatch, if any debris falls out of the attic, it doesn't soil the carpet. Sometimes attic hatches are in closets over people's clothing, so you can use this to cover the clothing when you open the attic hatch. Overalls for keeping yourself clean when you go into a crawl space. Might even wear them in an attic. A respirator or a dust mask to help keep from breathing in fiberglass insulation or anything else that might be bad for your health. And you can use that in an attic or a crawl space. Heavy gloves for use in crawl spaces. Heavy rubber gloves. The reason for this, if there is a leak from the toilet and you go down in the crawl space and discover that, you often discover that too late as far as your own personal health. You've already put your hands in contaminated material in the crawl space. I actually have heard of a couple of inspectors who have gotten sick from that. That's why you want to wear heavy rubber gloves in the crawl space. So even cloth gloves, any contaminated liquid in the crawl space can soak right through that cloth glove. And quite simply, what happens is, if you get any of this contamination on your fingers and then later you put your fingers anywhere near your mouth, whether that's because you're smoking or you're simply scratching your chin or your lip, that's a way for bacteria to get into your body. And yes, I actually have heard of a couple of home inspectors that have become sick from a bacteria that they can get from human feces. So, by simply wearing better grade rubber gloves, you are protecting yourself from that consequence. You'll want to have some way to protect your head, especially in a crawl space. A lot of inspectors simply wear a hard hat. It keeps their head from getting bumped by hitting joists or hitting beams. Keeps cobwebs off your head, keeps your head from hitting nails that are sticking through subflooring. A handheld vacuum, just in case something does get spilled, especially from the attic hatch. Roof gloves. In other words, gloves that you wear when you go up on a roof. There's two reasons for that. One is to keep your hands clean. And the other is some inspectors wear a sort of a sticky glove that helps them to grip the roof, especially when they're climbing back down off of the roof. Boots for winter climates in the snow or in the summer for mud, especially with newer houses. Every time I've inspected a newer home, it seemed like it would rain the night before, and they didn't have the sod completed yet, so I was walking around in mud. So you can have a pair of boots that you just leave in your inspection vehicle all the time. Some inspectors will change their shoes when they go inside the house simply as customer service. Or they will cover their shoes with a disposable bootie. You probably should have paper towels or clean rags in your vehicle, especially if you're going into a vacant home, so you have some way to wipe your hands clean. Another use for a clean rag is in wet months or colder winter months when people are stepping into the foyer, including your clients, and you're taking your wet shoes off there. It's just a nice customer service thing for you to be able to wipe down the floor tile to keep it dry, especially on your way out of the house. And you might want to carry soap and hand towels. Again, if you want to wash your hands, you have some way to get some soap and a hand towel and you get your hands clean. You know, in an occupied house, you should not be using the owner's hand towels or bath towels, unless you've been directed to do so by the current owner. This home inspector is wisely protecting his health with a respirator up in the attic. Now, having said that, I'll be honest with you, most home inspectors do not bother with respirators in attics. Most do not, but it's a good idea. This home inspector is also keeping his clothing clean with overalls that he will remove and put back in his vehicle when he steps down out of the attic. All right, that brings us to the contract or the pre-inspection agreement. We've talked about this earlier. You must always get your contract signed before the start of the home inspection. A great way to do this, and preferred by any attorney that would be representing you, is for you to email or fax the contract to the client as soon as the inspection is set up. Get it done right now. That way, there is no way for the client to claim later that they didn't have enough time to review the terms of the contract. So you should get the contract to your client at least 24 hours before the home inspection. That way, they have time to review it, sign it, and return it to you. And if, for some reason, you can't get that done, at least get it signed at the inspection, but before you start. But really, it's much better to get it signed earlier so they can't claim later that they weren't aware of the terms of the contract. You absolutely are going to have a good report format in place, all set up and ready to go before you set up your first fee-paid home inspection. We'll talk about report formats and reporting in general in Module 24. Now, remember that while both the home inspection and the report together are your product, only the report remains for the client to see. So you need to get a report as good as you can get it. This actually is often an inspector's single biggest investment, because good reporting software can cost $800, $1,000, or $1,200 or more. It really depends on what you want to buy. So definitely, when you choose your report format, spend the time it takes to get it the way you want it before doing your first paid home inspection. Now, we'll move into the home inspection process itself, and we'll begin with communication and consistency. The home inspection process is really about communication. In fact, every good inspector is a good communicator. You need to have the ability to deliver potentially bad news in a non-alarming manner. So, as an example, you wouldn't want to say to the client, "Oh my gosh, this furnace is in terrible condition." You would simply say, "Well, it appears that the furnace hasn't been maintained lately. It doesn't appear to be operating correctly, so I'm going to recommend further evaluation by a qualified heating contractor." You're essentially telling them the same thing, but in a much more non-alarming manner. You also have to work successfully with all types of personalities and viewpoints. And in fact, that's one of the things that makes the home inspection business so interesting. This is one of the few industries where if you don't like your client, as an example, that's okay, because you're probably done with them forever in the next 2 to 3 hours. A couple of things you want to stay away from during a home inspection. You should never talk politics or religion with any client, because you know what? You can never win with that. And you want to make sure that at the end of the inspection, your client likes you. So even if your client starts to talk about politics or religion or anything else that's bugging them, it's best to avoid these topics or respond to those topics if you must in a very generic way, because you don't want your client to get upset with you. A home inspection can be an emotional process for the participants. You typically have a home buyer, that's your client almost all the time. There's a home seller. There are one or more real estate agents involved. All three of those parties, or four if you're counting multiple agents, they're all nervous. Your client is nervous because it may turn out that the home is just a total wreck, that they're going to have to put all sorts of money into it. Or perhaps they're going to decide to not even buy the home, which means they have to start over. Both the seller and the agent are nervous that the buyer is going to walk away from the home. And of course, the seller doesn't want to lose the sale because they're trying to move on to another home or some other state, and they need to get this behind them. And the agent or agents are, of course, worried about losing the commission. Hopefully, the buyer is excited about their possible new home. The seller is going to be skeptical of you because who are you to come through their home and tell them that something's wrong with their house? Now, as I've said, we don't typically deal directly with the seller, but nevertheless, that's their viewpoint. You're going through their home and you're criticizing their home. The real estate agent is naturally going to be protective of their deal. That's understandable. They have a commission of several $1,000s riding on this deal. The buyer is going to be concerned for many reasons. The seller is going to be defensive. The real estate agent is going to be defensive, and the bottom line is always money. It always comes down to money. That's why they have all of these emotions. The buyer has spent a lot of time looking for a home. If this home turns out to have a lot of defects, they may have to spend a lot of money to correct it, or they have to try to negotiate that with the seller. Or they may end up walking away from the deal, which means they have to start over. That means they've lost more time, and time is money. And for the seller and the agent, if they lose the deal, that means money. If the seller ends up negotiating the repair of the defects with the buyer, of course, that means loss of money as well. So it always comes down to money, just like everything else in life. Throughout this entire process, your position as a home inspector should always remain the same: neutral. You truly do not care about the home, or whether or not the client buys the home, or whether or not the seller gets the sale, or whether or not the real estate agent gets the commission. We are there to simply look at function and safety. If the home turns out to be a piece of garbage, that's not your fault. You'll have more work to do in the report, but it's not your fault. You truly do not care if the buyer purchases the home or not, and that's our role. We're supposed to be unbiased. The buyer is very biased. They're all concerned about the house. They're excited about the home. They're nervous about the home. We don't care. That's our role. We go through the home, we list the defects, we tell our client what those defects are. They take the report and then they act accordingly. We are always neutral. We are the one party working for your client that doesn't really care if they buy the home or not. When you're at the inspection, remember, the clients are always the most important people there. Make sure you address all of their concerns, no matter how trivial it may seem. Remember, what may seem minor to you may seem major to them. So even if they ask the same question over and over, you need to continue to answer the question. If they keep asking the same question over and over, then you're probably not explaining it in a way they understand. So you need to find a different way to explain it, and again, what seems minor to you might seem huge to them. So while you look at an outlet missing a cover plate and you think, gee, that's only $1, that's not a big deal, well, to them, that missing cover plate is a huge issue. Because you've mentioned that it's a possible shock issue and they don't even know where to buy a cover plate. So that's why you have to be very patient with your client. After all, they're paying you $300, $325 or more, and they feel that's a lot of money, so they expect you to give them full attention. Make sure you communicate on your client's level and in everyone else's level. As an example, most people don't know what a double tap is. Perhaps you don't even know what a double tap is, and it is an electrical defect. We'll talk about that at the end of the course. But if you want to report a double tap, then you should explain it both verbally to your client and explain it on the report. Don't just say, hey, I saw a double tap. You need to tell them what it is, why it's a defect, and what should be done about it. It's best to have your clients at the home inspection whenever possible. Veteran inspectors will always tell you that there is much more likely to be issues with clients that weren't there, because those people don't really know how hard you work. They don't know what you did and what you didn't do. So make it clear when setting up the home inspection that you want them there, and try to work around their schedule if necessary to help them be there. So if you say, hey, I can be there Tuesday at 2 o'clock, and they say, you know what, that just won't work for us, but if you could do it at 3 o'clock Tuesday, we can get there. But maybe you don't normally like to do inspections at 3 o'clock, but that's not that big a deal, really. So if you can make it work at 3 o'clock, then do so for them. It's always better to bend your schedule if possible to meet your client's schedule and get them at the inspection. Things will almost always go smoother when your client is there. Let's take a look at the difference between having the client at the home inspection and not having the client there. When the client is there, it builds trust between you and the client. It establishes expectations because you can go over, once again, what you will do and what you won't do in the home inspection. Now, that is something you should have discussed in the initial telephone call with the client, but you can talk about it again at the inspection. Sure, it's going to take a little bit more time to have the client there because you're going to have to answer questions and show them stuff. But that's good because the clients see how hard you've worked for them. They see that you really worked up a sweat in that 2 to 3 hour period, that you went in the attic, you went in the crawl space, that you walked the roof for them, that you did all these things for them. And you have a chance to close out the inspection at the end and answer any final questions a client might have. And you can leave that inspection on a high note. You've gotten your check and you can tell them when they are going to get the report. And they can feel really good about you. When the clients are not there, sure, it might be a little bit quicker inspection. But they don't really know what you did, and you're going to need possibly to provide more detail on your report. Because since you're not talking to your client face to face, you really can't read them. You don't really know what minor things are of concern to them. Now, you should be doing essentially the same report whether or not your clients are there. But absolutely, if your client seems bugged about something small, you may include it on the report when you normally would not otherwise. But when your client is not there, you really have no idea what's bugging them. And absolutely, you're going to have to answer questions later by telephone that's much more difficult. Consistency is a very important part of the home inspection process. In fact, the keys to being a proficient inspector are consistent inspection habits and consistent procedures. This is critical. You must perform every inspection in the exact same manner and the exact same order every single time. Now, in the upcoming slides, we're going to teach you an inspection order. Now, do you have to follow that order exactly the way we taught it? It would probably be better, but in all honesty, home inspectors follow different orders. Whatever order you choose, I guess that's going to be okay, although we do think the order we teach is the best one. But what's important is that however you choose to do it the same way every single time. That keeps you from forgetting things. That keeps you from overlooking things. All houses have the same basic components. Bigger houses simply have more of those, and smaller houses have less of those. Every home has a roof, and a foundation, and plumbing, and at least one bathroom, and at least one kitchen. So we should perform every inspection in the exact same manner and order every single time. It's very important to do what you have promised. Now, that sounds kind of obvious. I know, but let me give you an example. Let's say that the client wants to get the home inspection report as quick as possible. And they say, "Can you get that report to me tonight?" And you say, "I just don't think that's possible. I have another inspection to do. I do the reports in the evening. I can certainly get it to you by 8 o'clock tomorrow morning." And the client says, "No, I just don't know if that's going to work. This is a short sale. The deal is moving quickly. I need to get this report by tonight. Can you have it to me by 8:30 tonight?" And you end up giving in. You say, "Okay, I'll see if I can get that done for you by 8:30 tonight." So you blow through that second inspection, and you're driving home as quick as you can. And you push the report out, and let's say you get it emailed to your client or uploaded to your server, and you get that done by 8:40. And you think, "Wow, I got him the report." Well, remember, you promised to get it to the client by 8:30, and it may not seem like much, but from the client's point of view, not only did he not get it by 8:30, you got it done 10 minutes late, and it might not seem like a big thing to you, but it's one of those things where it gets the client kind of aggravated with you. There might be something they're doing at 8:30. Maybe they're sitting in the real estate office waiting to close this deal. There's people sitting around and they keep checking for the report and checking for the report. And the fact that you did everything you could to get it done by 8:30, you feel good about yourself. From their point of view, it looks like you failed. And this is what we mean by do what you've promised. So it's not the obvious stuff. It's those small things that can get your client aggravated with you. Obviously, in that example, the best thing would have been to not promise it by 8:30. And sometimes that's a hindsight thing, I understand, but you see what we're talking about here. Be very careful with what you promise. And if you do promise something, make sure you can deliver. You want to write what you say and say what you write. What we're talking about here is you really shouldn't say anything to anybody that you're not willing to put in writing. And you shouldn't put anything in writing that you're not willing to say to somebody's face. So if you think the roof is in very bad shape, then you should say that and put that in the report. You shouldn't say, "Well, the roof looks like it's older," and then put in your report that it needs to be immediately evaluated by a roofing contractor. That's not consistent. So that's what we mean by write what you say and say what you write. Again, it's consistency. Whatever you would say to someone's face, should be all that you would put in the report and nothing more. Here's the inspection order as we teach it. First of all, everything is top down. Literally, everything is top down. So on the exterior of the house, that means visually. You start from the roof to the ground. And when you get inside the home, you start at the highest portion of the home, usually the attic, and you work your way down through the house to the foundation level. Within each room, you start at the ceiling and work your way down to the floor. And everything is outside in, from the exterior to the garage to the interior. It's important to always work the complete circle as well. That means all around the exterior of the home, and when you get inside the home, literally you start in one corner of the room and you work your way visually around the entire room, all four walls until you get back to that corner of the room. And then the last three we like to do in order. The electric panel or panels, some houses do have subpanels, the water heater or water heaters if there's more than one, and lastly, the heating equipment. We always like to finish with the heating equipment. Now, can you deviate from this order? Sure you can. Is it critical that you do the furnace very last? What if you were to do the electric panels last? That's fine. But whatever order you choose, just make sure you do it the exact same way in every single house. What you're trying to do is form a habit. Because if you form good habits, that helps to keep you from forgetting things. When you follow a certain order, if for some reason you do go out of order because you're just having a bad day or something distracts you, well, you'll feel it right away. You'll know that you went out of order, and that will cause you, hopefully, to stop and think about it. Okay, what's going wrong here? Oh, I forgot to do the water heater, or oh, I missed this. That's why we want to do everything in the same order every single time. I also want to mention a fairly common variation. Some home inspectors like to do the interior first, particularly of the attic, before they walk on the roof. So some inspectors start on the interior of the home and go to the exterior. I think it works better to start on the exterior, and especially if you see any signs of structural defects or signs of possible seepage because of bad grading, then you have a chance to look for those defects on the interior. But again, if you want to do it inside out, that's probably not a huge difference, and that's okay as long as you do it the same way every single time. One exception is I did say start at the top and work down. But when we get inside of the house, we don't waste time looking for the attic access. You'll find it eventually, so we simply check the attic when we get to it. We work the rooms on each floor in an orderly manner. So if it's a long house with a long hallway, maybe you just work the rooms down one side of a hall and then you go back on the other side. Or a lot of homes, you go into a foyer and there's a central stairway. So maybe you simply work your way around each room and just go right around the central stairway. When rooms open off of other rooms, keep going. Go all the way out to the farthest room until you can't go any farther, and then work your way back out. That way you won't miss any intermediate rooms. We'll use this floor plan to illustrate an inspection process in an actual home. Here you can see the first and second floor. This home is on a slab, so there's no basement or a crawl space. The furnace, water heater, and electrical panel are in the garage. The front entrance of this home would be at the blue arrow, where you would walk up a few stairs onto a covered porch. So you want to start with the exterior. You'll start somewhere around the house. It doesn't have to be at the blue arrow. You can certainly start there if you want, but the main thing is you work the complete circle around the home. As you go around any house, if there is a deck or exterior porch, that's the time to do those. You'll need to do the roof, whether you walk that roof or look at it from the ground or a ladder at the eaves. When you're done with the roof, you'll move into the garage, which is right here. Now, because I like to do water heaters, furnaces, and electric panels last, I'm going to skip over those in the garage and simply do the garage itself, the door opener, the outlets, and so forth. And then I'm going to enter the home. Now, you can either enter the home from the front by the blue arrow, or up these stairs here and into the kitchen. It doesn't really matter, because once you get into the home, you're going to proceed upstairs right here, because you want to start upstairs. So, as you go up the stairs, you will end up in the second floor hallway, moving over to the right, which is right here. Knowing that this home probably has a master bedroom suite, I'm going to start there. So as I worked my way down into the master bedroom suite, I'll find the master bathroom right here. I'm actually going to start there because I know that master bath suite has a whirlpool tub. It needs to be filled up. That takes a little bit of time, and I don't want to walk away from a whirlpool tub that's filling. That's a good way to have a big problem. If you forget that it's filling, it'll possibly overflow and cause a lot of damage. So I'll check the master bath. When that's done, I'll go ahead and move down the hall to the master bedroom itself. Now, I'll see that there is a screen porch that's accessible only from the interior of the home. So I'll go ahead, because I do rooms off of rooms, I'll go walk to that screen porch. I'll complete the screen porch, then I'll come back into the master bedroom. When that's done, I'll do these closets. I'll do either closet, it doesn't matter. Let's pick the one on the left. I'll do the small closet, then I'll do the larger closet, and I'll find this is where the attic access is. So at this point, I'll stop. I'll go downstairs, get my ladder, bring it back up, inspect the attic. When I come out of the attic, I will take the ladder downstairs and put it safely out of the way. Then I'll come back up and finish this closet. Then I'll work my way down this hall and actually inspect the hall. That means the ceiling, and there's outlets or whatever is in there, and I'll end up back in this corridor. Now, I'll get to pick a bedroom, so I'll pick bedroom 3. So I walk through that little hallway to the bedroom 3. Because I do rooms that open off of rooms, that means closets. So I'll start with that closet. Then, back in the bedroom, I'll see another room that opens off the bedroom, and it turns out it's bath 2, which is a Jack and Jill arrangement with 2 doors. So I'll go ahead and complete the bathroom. I'll do bath 2. I will not proceed through the door into the other bedroom though. I'll stop there, I'll finish the bathroom, then I'll come back, do bedroom 3, finish that bedroom, and do the closet. It's really off of this corridor, and then do that corridor itself. And then it will come out here, walk down this corridor, and I'm in bedroom 4. But because I do rooms off of rooms, I will start with this closet first. Then I'll do bedroom 4. Then I'll do this hallway. I've already done bath 2, so I don't have to worry about it. Complete this area of the home, and then I'll work my way back downstairs. And I will end up back on the first floor in the dining room. At this point, I'm going to start at the front of the house. I'll do the living room. Now, I move back into the dining room. I've already done the covered porch when I was outside. So then when I get to this hallway, I want to do rooms off of rooms, so I'll proceed into this guest and study room. I'll find there's a bathroom there, so I'll do the bathroom. When I'm done with the bathroom, I'll come back out into that guest study room and I'll see there's a closet underneath the stairs. So I'll do that closet. Then I'll finish the guest study room. Then I'll go out and finish this hallway, which will take me to the kitchen. I'm going to move through the kitchen just so I can get this family breakfast area finished up. Then I move back into the kitchen. And because there is a pantry, I'll do that pantry, which is right there. And then I'll do the kitchen itself. And at that point, I will go back out to the garage to finish those last 3 items: the electric panels, the water heater, and the furnace. So that is how I would approach this floor plan. Now, we'll talk about what actually goes on at the inspection. Now, we're not going to talk about all the technical sections, we're going to cover that later. But we're going to talk about things to say to the client, things you don't say, and how to conduct yourself. Now, when you show up to the inspection, remember, the inspection starts in the street. You want to have a decent and clean vehicle. It doesn't have to be a brand new vehicle, but it can't be a rust box or filthy. You need to look like a professional. You should dress appropriately. We talked about this earlier. You don't want to show up with a bunch of filthy clothes or covered in tar or oil or paint. You want to look like you've done this before. You want to look like a true professional. If the house is in an urban area, I would recommend not parking in the driveway or else be prepared to move. You know, if you park in the driveway, you might get boxed in by your clients as well. So generally, we try to park in the street, so that when it comes time to leave, there's nobody parked behind you. We recommend arriving to any home inspection at least 20 minutes before the scheduled time. 30 minutes is better. So if the inspection is supposed to start at 2 o'clock, this means you're there at 20 minutes until 2. Really, I like to get there by 1:30. This gives you a chance to scope out the house. It also gives you a chance to have some recovery time if you have trouble finding the home. Knock on the door, and if anybody answers, introduce yourself. Tell them briefly what to expect and for about how long you plan to be there. In areas of the country where you will get your own access to the house from real estate agents, you should still knock on the door first so nobody is surprised. Then get yourself started on the exterior. When you're inspecting the exterior, always be aware of any kids in the area that might climb up your ladder when you're on the roof, or that might grab your tools, or might otherwise cause you some kind of headache. Always be aware of anything you might step in that you don't want to step in, such as mud, grease, or oil, or tar, or even dog poo. Always make note of where the electric meter is on the exterior, because once you get inside the home, if you have trouble locating the electric panel, it's usually right behind the meter location inside the house. Be aware of the plumbing vent. If you don't see a plumbing vent, then they might have a whole house air admittance valve in the attic. Those are becoming more common in certain areas. In some states, they're illegal, so either make sure you see a plumbing vent or make note of the fact that there isn't one, so you can check the attic later. Be aware of any dogs or other animals that might be surprised by your presence when you burst into a yard. And always be aware of the arrival of your client. If you're behind the home and you hear car doors closing, then chances are those car doors are from your client, so you should walk around and greet them. You definitely want to meet and greet the clients when they arrive. If there are more than one client, you should address them equally. until they kind of let you know through their actions who is most interested in the inspection. The reason I bring this up is I know a lot of inspectors that have made this mistake. There was a husband and a wife, or certainly at least a lady and a guy showing up as the client. And the inspector makes the mistake of addressing the man more than the lady. That's a huge mistake for many, many reasons. So if it ends up that the husband or the guy is the one that's more interested in the inspection process, so be it. But until this couple lets you know who is most interested in the inspection process, you treat them equally. You answer their questions equally. You give them both eye contact. That's all I'm suggesting. So it doesn't even matter if it's a guy and a guy, or a woman and a woman, or a guy and a woman, or a brother and a sister. It doesn't matter. You let the clients kind of indicate to you who's most interested in the inspection, and it may turn out that they both are interested in walking around during the inspection with you. And they both ask questions. That's fine. You give everybody a business card, both the clients. If they have friends that came along, you give them a business card. Basically, anybody over the age of 18 should get a business card, because they are people that are in positions to buy homes and or refer you to people they know. If you haven't already had the contract signed, get it signed now. And even with having the contract signed in advance, you should review it with them again briefly. Now again, we talked earlier about just even having a blank contract with you so that you can go over it with your client. Just hit the key terms with them. Briefly explain what you plan to do. Ask them if there's any questions. You might already know of questions they had from the initial telephone conversation with them. Show them around the exterior. Have lots of patience. Remember, no question is stupid. They are buying 2 or 3 hours of your time. So you answer all of their questions. In reviewing the contract with your client at the beginning of the inspection, important things to mention include the fact that you don't do swing sets or sheds or pools or hot tubs. So if you're getting to the inspection early, which you should be, this is your chance to see these items and then remind your client, hey, you know what? I just got here a few minutes ago and I may have mentioned this to you on the phone, but just so you know, we don't include the swing set or we don't include the swimming pool. You remind them again that it's not a building code inspection. It's definitely a function and safety inspection. But you're not going to cover building codes per se. It's a limited visual inspection, and you're not going to be moving furniture or pulling up the carpeting. And generally, inspectors like to be paid at the end of the inspection. So that's what you can say. Say payment is due upon the end of the inspection, or payment is due under whatever arrangements you've already made with the client. When you're inspecting the exterior, make sure you start far enough away from the house so that you can see the entire home, if possible, at a glance. Now, I realize that in densely populated urban areas, in most of these neighborhoods, it's hard to get very far away from the home, so do the best you can. But in suburban areas or in rural areas, it's usually a lot easier to get away from the house for a distance where you can see the entire home and check it for plumb and square. Make sure it's not leaning, in other words. You want to make sure the roof isn't sagging. You want to make sure it looks like the house isn't sitting in a low spot. You want to make note of any trees or any other vegetation overhanging the home. As you go around the house, this is when you make note of any items not included that you've seen on the property, so that when your client does show up, you can remind them that you're not doing swing sets and sheds and so forth. And at this point, it's a great time to locate a safe way to get on the roof or decide that you're not going to walk on the roof. So you want to get as far away from the house as you can, within reason, and view the house from a distance if possible. You start visually at the top and work your way down. And then you check walls for plumb and make sure none of the walls are bowing out as you walk around the corner. So literally, as you approach the corner of a house, you can eyeball the plane of a wall from the end of that plane. This is a good time to see if the walls are bowing out. When you enter the home, make sure that you have absolutely clean shoes, or change into your clean indoor shoes if that's what you want to do, or put clean booties over your shoes. Or some inspectors remove their shoes and walk around in their stocking feet. Whatever you do is up to you. Just make sure you don't track anything nasty into the home. Start upstairs if it's a multi-story home, or pick a logical starting point if it's a single story. Usually, you start in the bedroom area. Work your way down to the basement or crawl space. And remember, I like to do electric panels, water heaters, and furnaces last. That's why we teach it in this course. If you want to create a slight variation on that, that's up to you. Just make sure you stick with the same process every single time on every home that you inspect. One thing I haven't mentioned yet, when I get inside the house, I like to find the thermostat. It's usually pretty easy to find and put the fan into the on position. And there will be an on position unless the house does not have central air conditioning. That way, the fan is running and you can check airflow from the diffusers as you go through the house. Remember to work the cycle top down. Complete the circle in each room. Move on to the next room as it fits into the order that you've decided on. As you go through the house, enter data into your handheld device, whether that's a phone or a tablet, or make a lot of notes and take a lot of pictures. Don't try to remember everything. That's a mistake. And check the attic when you find it. Be very careful with built-in attic ladders, as you see here. A lot of times, the hardware is loose and the ladder is getting ready to fall apart. So there's a lot of loose nuts and bolts. Put those on the report. And if it's bad enough, perhaps you don't even use this attic ladder. Maybe you use your own ladder on top of this ladder to get into the attic. So always check the hardware. Here are a few tips that can really help you out down the road as you get started in your inspection career. First of all, never ever start an oven or a dishwasher without first checking the interior. That's part of the inspection anyway, checking the interior of these appliances. But I've seen a lot of weird things in both of these over the years. I've seen pizza boxes inside ovens complete with moldy pizza. One of my inspectors started an oven one time without checking the interior and melted some Tupperware. Fortunately, that didn't damage the oven, and the owner was pretty nice about it and accepted a cash payment of $15 to be done with the issue. So we were fortunate with that. I've seen cereal boxes in dishwashers. I've seen folded towels. Sometimes people use dishwashers as cabinets, so always check the interiors of those appliances before you start them. And when you start a dishwasher, start it soon enough to allow it to go through a complete wash, drain, and rinse cycle. What we're trying to do, and you don't need to put soap in there, all we're trying to do is get the dishwasher to run long enough to leak if it's going to do so. And hopefully, that'll show up during the home inspection. Make liberal use of your moisture meter. I'm assuming you're going to have a moisture meter because most inspectors do. Have it with you. Anytime you see a stain, you can find out if there's any current moisture. Always check out bathrooms and kitchens, even when the crawl space access is supremely tight. Remember, the harder it is to get in a crawl space, the more likely it is you're going to find plumbing leaks, because nobody's been in there for years. So even if it's difficult access and you can't get all the way around the house in a crawl space, at least try to check underneath bathrooms and kitchens. And in a home with a crawl space, make sure you run a lot of water. Check all the plumbing before you go in the crawl space, even if the crawl space has exterior access. Because if any leaks are present, you want to make sure they're going to be leaking when you get into that crawl space. If any rooms or areas that you're supposed to be inspecting are blocked by stored items, or if foundation walls and basements are covered by finishes, make sure you note this on the report as restricted view and provide a photo or two. Always make note of stains on ceilings and walls, whether they're wet or dry. Tell your client to check with the current owner if the stain seems to be dry. And use your ears. As an example, if you hear water moving through waste lines down to the basement or crawl space after you've already checked the bathrooms, and there is nobody else in the house or the client is with you, and there's nobody else in the house, then probably a toilet tank is leaking into the bowl. Or you've left the faucet on, or your client has left the faucet on somewhere. So go back and find the source of that moving water. Here's an example of a photo that you would put right in the report. You would report this as a restricted view. There's a lot of area of the foundation wall you can't see. You might even have difficulty getting access to the furnace and water heater, which are right behind that cast iron waistline towards the center right of the photo. And besides the fact that you can't see the foundation walls very well, with this much clutter in the basement, it's very difficult to walk around and look at the overhead structure in this basement. So absolutely, there's going to be defects that you probably won't be able to find because of all this clutter. So make sure it's reported. It's very important to control the inspection process. It's your inspection. You're in charge. First of all, don't ever deviate from your normal inspection process unless absolutely necessary. And very few things make it necessary. If you show up and the current owner is home, and they say they have a baby sleeping in a bedroom, fair enough. I'll skip over that bedroom. Hopefully, I can get back into the bedroom after the baby has arisen before the end of the inspection. If not, then I'm going to put that on the report that I wasn't able to inspect that bedroom at the owner's request. Otherwise, there's very few things that would make me go out of order. If someone simply asks you as a convenience to them, "Hey, can you start in the basement and work your way up?" No, I can't. I always have to work from the top down. Don't let the client get you off course by asking too many questions. Now, certainly, it's their right to ask questions, but sometimes you just have to politely tell them that you'll answer certain questions at the appropriate times. As an example, you're upstairs checking the bedrooms, and the client keeps asking you about the furnace. Simply tell them, "You know what, when we get down to the furnace, I'll be glad to take those questions, but right now I need to focus on this part of the inspection, so I won't miss anything on your behalf." If you say that, they'll understand it. And don't be bamboozled by owners or real estate agents. Check everything for yourself. As an example, if someone says you don't even need to check the furnace, it's brand new, literally it was put in 2 days ago by a great heating contractor, fine with me, but I'm still going to check it. I have to make sure it was installed properly. I have to make sure it's operating properly. Remember, you work for the client and only for the client. Accordingly, you don't want to discuss your findings of the inspection with the owner or anybody else other than the client or the client's representatives. It's okay, though, to ask the current owner important questions such as, "Why is the circuit breaker off?" or "Why is the gas shut off to the furnace?" And depending on what they tell you, it doesn't mean they'll turn that stuff on necessarily. But you might put it in the report. I've been on inspections where the current owner said, well, yeah, the gas is shut off because we thought there was a gas leak. And we plan to have a heating guy come out here this afternoon or tomorrow to examine it and make repairs. That's good information. I'll put that in my report. I'll simply say, as per the current owner, there is a possible gas leak that is to be repaired. Recommend that the client verify that with the current owner prior to closing. That's all I would say. Now, if the current owner is there and they're just kind of rude to you or belligerent, don't get rude back with them. You don't want to get into some kind of argument or physical fistfight or anything. Just deal with it, or if you have to, reschedule the inspection. I've actually done that a couple of times. When the current owner was home, they were making all sorts of trouble. I ended up taking the client aside, and both times I've done this, the client agreed. I said, you know what? Maybe we should reschedule this inspection. And the client said, I absolutely agree. This guy is a goofball. Let's get out of here. Now, if you want to charge additional because you have to come back for that inspection, that's entirely up to you. It's certainly within your right, but however you handle that is up to you. The point I just want to make here is, if the owner is a complete jerk, sometimes you have to reschedule the inspection if you can't avoid them. Very, very important to avoid any and all confrontations. As a home inspector, it's very important for you to know who is at the inspection. So you want to make sure you introduce yourself to anybody else. Find out who they are and what their purpose is in being there. The reason for this is quite simple, in that you want to make sure you don't say something about the condition of the home to anybody other than your client, or someone that is there on behalf of your client. So you really don't want to say anything in front of a friend of the current owner, as an example, or even the current owner if you don't know who they are. That's why you need to find out. It's also not a bad idea to simply gather names and write that down somewhere for your own personal information, so that if anything unusual or something weird happens at inspection, then later on, you would have a list of the people that were there that are either witnesses to the event or could talk about what happened. I mean, there are some unusual situations every once in a while. I've heard of a few inspectors over the years being accused of stealing stuff. And it would certainly help to know who else is there if you are ever accused of that. These aren't things that go on a lot, but I do know of quite a few inspectors that routinely will write down the names of everybody that was at the inspection and why they were there. And they just keep it for their own use, just in case. It's not a bad idea, but again, the primary reason for knowing these people is to make sure you don't speak out of turn to anybody other than your client or someone there on behalf of your client. You want to make sure that nobody mooches information off of you, and that's not because you're being a jerk. It's simply because any other professionals that show up, first of all, they need to do their own job. I've actually had appraisers come up to me during a home inspection. And at least in my area, we don't commonly see appraisers, but every once in a while, the appraiser schedule is the same time as my inspection. At least one time, they had an appraiser come up to me and say, hey, have you seen the electric panel yet? And I said, yeah, because I'm wrapping up here. Well, what's the amperage? Well, I don't want to tell them. Again, not because I'm a jerk, but first of all, they need to do their own job. But secondly, if I'm actually wrong about the amperage, it's bad enough that I'm going to be wrong in my own report, but I don't need my bad information to go into somebody else's report. So that's why they need to do their own job and find that information out for themselves. That's why I don't want to share. If I'm wrong, it's only wrong in my report. I've actually had termite inspectors come up to me and ask me how their crawl space looked. That's their job and they need to do that. Absolutely, you want to minimize or prevent interference with your inspection process by any other parties. Remember to always represent yourself as a true professional no matter what. You have to be courteous to everyone, no matter how rude they've been to you, even if you want to choke them. And yes, at some point you're going to want to choke somebody. That's part of the business. It's part of dealing with people. And as you know, choking people is bad for business. But you will have your share of rude real estate agents and rude owners. And occasionally, you're not going to like your client at all. But at least you can typically get done with your client in 2 to 3 hours and get the check and feel better about yourself. So again, be courteous to everyone, no matter what. Make sure you leave everything in the home exactly the way you found it. The perfect home inspection, at least from the homeowner's point of view, is that they come home and they think that for some reason the inspection was canceled. They don't know that you were ever there. If you break something, just admit it and deal with it. If you're careful, very few things should break, but sometimes things do go wrong. I've broken 2 or 3 things in my career. I remember one time I accidentally knocked an iron off an ironing board. I left a note for the current owner because they weren't home. I left my business card. I talked to the real estate agent about it. The next day, the current owner gave me a call and said, "Don't worry about it." They had another iron and they appreciated my honesty. So that one turned out really nicely. I've had a couple of other fairly minor incidents in which something was broken, and I wrote him a check for tens of dollars, like 20 or 30 bucks. But the thing is, if you break something and try to cover it up, that's when they can go very bad for you. Someone will discover it, someone will get very angry, and that's when a $10 clock turns into a $500 clock. So, if you break something, just admit it and deal with it as quickly as possible. You want to try to maintain a dialogue with your clients during the inspection, but don't let it slow you down. The reason you want to maintain a dialogue with them, even if you really have nothing to say, because there really aren't any defects that you're finding, you just want to maintain a dialogue because it helps to build a sort of friendship with your client. And that's the way you get referrals. Just make sure you're not just standing and chatting with them, though. Keep moving through the home and absolutely don't tell war stories. Stick to the job. Nobody really cares how you've stepped through a ceiling on some other inspection. You might think it's amusing, but don't bring it up. Stick to the inspection. Get done with it as quickly as you can. And I'm not saying move so quickly that you're going to miss stuff, but the point is to move through the home with a purpose. Get your job done. Get to the end of the inspection. Wrap things up with your client and move forward. That's being a true professional. Telling war stories is not being a true professional, so just stay away from that kind of stuff. When you get to the end of the inspection, this is when you present your findings. Or, if you can do the report on site, then go ahead and present the report. Just make sure the owner is not within earshot. If the owner is not at home or not in the house, then go ahead and talk with the client in the house. If the owner is home on a nice summer day, go outside and talk the house. If the owner is home and it's a cold winter day, then nicely ask the owner to give you some space. They usually will, and just find a quiet area to talk about things with your client for a few minutes. Ask your client if there's any other questions, collect your fee, thank your clients, and then tell them to call you with questions about the house for as long as they live there. They probably won't call. If they do, that's good. That means they're thinking of you, and that's a way to build referrals. Be sure to thank real estate agents for referrals if they're there and if appropriate. So, to wrap up, the inspection business is a great business that allows you to use your many talents, business talents, marketing, technical, and communications. It's never boring. Every house is different, and you'll meet many interesting people from all walks of life. You can make a lot of money in this business. It's all up to you, so be sure to have fun with your inspections and enjoy the ride. And that's the end of Module 3.